Hi everyone, thank you for joining for today's video. I was really excited to interview this person. Unfortunately, our internet dropped off right at the beginning, so she actually had to dial in from her phone to do this interview. So Margot, thank you so much for taking out the time to do that. Margot Leitman is an award-winning storyteller, being the first Moth Grandslam champion to score a perfect 10. She is the author of the best-selling Long Story Short, The Only Story Guide You'll Ever Need, as well as books like Gawky and What's Your Story. She's also a former story scout for This American Life, and in normal times, she'll be traveling all around the world teaching people to tell their stories. But as you'll hear during these COVID times, she's actually working on her own passion project. Check it out. Margot, you've taught everyone from CEOs to physicists to homicide detectives how to tell their stories effectively. What do you think why do you think the want to be a storyteller is so universal?
Well, there's really no downside to being able to tell a good story, first of all. It's one of the few things that is just all positive results. It can make you more charming, seem more attractive, more hireable, more funny. All of these things can really help move your career forward. And it also builds a lot of confidence. I've seen long-term students I've had really lives completely change from being able to tell a story properly, from getting married to getting hired to getting promoted to making a career shift, all after figuring out how to tell their own story. One of my favorite students was a voiceover artist who was not booking anything. And she was studying for a while, and she realized that once she was able to tell her own story and understand story structure, she was able to see a story in the small copy that she was reading. And it was amazing to see her eventually have to drop out of class after a while because she was booking so many things and she didn't have time to be in the class anymore. And she said she owes it all to figuring out how to understand her own story and story structure. So it can really, really change your career.
That's incredible. I love that because I think a lot of people that I talk to are almost afraid to tell their own story sometimes. They're almost afraid to
Yeah.
be vulnerable at times. Um, how do you speak to somebody who thinks they may have a story or they're a little bit nervous about sharing it too widely to almost test out that story?
Um, well, in order to test out a story, I find that if socially a story is something that you tell a lot, then often a crowd will like it. So if you find yourself repeating the same story over and over again about some incident that happened, it's probably a good indication that the masses will enjoy it. There's online shows right now, a lot of writers groups. You can get coached, you could take a class in it. Ask your job to take a storytelling initiative. I mean, I personally have gone to many companies and helped with storytelling initiatives, and I'm not the only person doing this out there. So, but if there's interest, your company may help work with that. But at the end of the day, if you're nervous about it, think about the rewards that are paid tenfold from people being vulnerable. Like Oprah Winfrey is a great example of how her brand really grew after she shared her vulnerable story. She became more relatable. And, I really think she wouldn't be where she was had she not shared her story. And who doesn't want to be like Oprah?
That's such a powerful example there.
I guess I just went for the best one.
Yeah, I don't think you can go much bigger than Oprah. It's like
No, you
I
can't.
think it's almost like you've got Oprah and maybe Tom Hanks just short. Other than that,
Right.
you can't get much bigger. I love that. So for you then, like when people do have the confidence then to share their story, how can people make their story stand out over all of the noise of information that's out there?
Well, it's got to be a skilled story. You have to have skills. You have to build them up and understand story structure. Being sincere really helps, and being vulnerable. So those would be the three things. So a good example of a story that really stood out was the Jim Carrey graduation speech he gave at a university. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a longer thing. It's about 20 minutes, which is rare to keep people's attention that long. But he's so sincere, so vulnerable in that story, and like really shares a lot of his personal story to where he is that he's never shared before, that it's very unusual for something that's over 3 minutes to go viral in the way that that did. And I've watched the whole thing, and I've encouraged other clients I've worked with to actually watch that, and people have learned a lot from it. It was well performed. It was well prepared, is another thing to look at. Another great example of a story that stood out was Monica Lewinsky's TED Talk. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's concise, it's conversational, she's approachable, she's relatable, but she is vulnerable and sincere. So those are two that have really, really stood out and been very powerful. And these were people that took their stories, owned their stories, shared their stories in a way that was prepared and really connected with the audience. And these are things that are referenced constantly. So the big thing is you do have to prepare and understand story structure and try not to ramble.
I was actually speaking to a good friend of mine, Dara Hickey, recently about storytelling, and he quoted, I think it was George Orwell, that said, "It's better to tell a story in one word than in 2 words."
Yes.
So
Yes, I have something
butchering
like that in my
quote,
book, a quote like that. Yeah, absolutely. There's a quote like that in my book as well. That's not as good as that, but it's close to it. It's something like, I want to say something in a page that can be done in a book or something like that. Absolutely. Yeah. I'll find it for you after.
Is this your book, Long Story Short?
Yeah, this is my beat up copy that I use for all of my events. It's all written in and all of that.
Fantastic. Speaking of Long Story Short, I actually wanted to bring up something that you highlight in your book,
Yeah.
which is that when it comes to businesses in particular, how people don't buy products because of like just facts about the products. They buy products because they feel like they're part of the story behind the products.
Yeah.
How can businesses or founders make somebody feel like that they're part of their business's story?
I think a really solid origin story that goes back to what really started it all. I actually have the one I was thinking of, Kevin Plank from Under Armour does a really good job with that. He talks about being a pro football player and then not being happy with the undergarments he had to wear and then wanting to find something else, and building this brand from the ground up in his grandmother's basement. All of these things, it's like there's a person. This was founded by an ex-football player who was wondering what's next. I can relate to figuring out what's next. He's an underdog because he's doing it in his grandmother's basement. You know, all of these things. It's a very strong story. So then we feel like we're investing in this entrepreneur's business. But I really do think that you have to be effective and genuine with your origin story. We're all sick of the people that pretend they come from nothing and that really were born into millions. We're all sick of that. I won't name names. We know many of these people. But you know, it should be really personalized. It should really attach to the people. So a lot of times it says it was founded because of blank, but who are the people behind it, you know?
So it's really about making it almost like that, like empathetic connection, where it almost like when you're watching a movie and you're like, oh, like that character overcame so many challenges. Like they actually, you almost root for them. It's like the underdog story that you root for.
Absolutely. Nike's doing it very well with everything with the take a knee. Steve Jobs did it very well by talking about getting fired. Lorne Michaels does it well with Saturday Night Live, talking about getting fired as well. These are all very vulnerable things to admit with these huge brands, Saturday Night Live, Mac, Under Armour, Nike. J.K. Rowling did it very well by incorporating her story of being a poor single mother and writing these books and hoping for the best and then catching a break. You know, she's the richest living author we have right now, but we still view her as this underdog single mom. So it's very interesting. And those are vulnerable things to admit. But to me, people are scared to admit their path to get to where they are. Mm-hmm. But who can relate to someone that was always perfect? We want to see the path to getting where you are. We really, really, really do. And we love a comeback too.
Nothing beats a good comeback story.
Nothing beats a good comeback story.
I love it. And, you know, I mentioned entrepreneurs and founders, and it seems like you actually have an entrepreneurial spirit yourself, because You've started your own
I know.
storytelling events, your own storytelling practice. You're, an author. Like, what kind of challenges have you faced in getting out your story of like with your business and with your practice, like where you've come
Well,
from?
I think it's interesting because I don't come from a business background. I studied theater in college. And I work a ton in business now because of it. It's so relevant to businesses. So it's very hard sometimes for me to explain how I got here, because it's not like I got trained as a medical x-ray technician and then I was placed at a hospital. It doesn't work like that. My story has ups and downs and figuring out and some tears and some heartache and giving up and all of those things. But at the end of the day, the way I realized that a lot of it was up to chance and fate, but at the same time, there are universal themes that people can relate to about my story. Switching gears, being told something's impossible, creating your own career path right now is a big thing. We are looking at a world right now that is not always about getting hired at the best job, but creating the best job. And that's the world I like living in, being driven, giving it your all. All of these are universal themes that I pepper in when I talk about my story. But the truth of it is, I don't know if I talk about this in the book or not, but I love at talks to say that I was doing stand-up. I finally got signed with this big manager. I was the first woman they had ever signed at the company because they were having trouble finding funny women. And that was what they said. And they told me, I know, it was a really great time to be a female in comedy. And so I sat down and I said, okay, so now that we're working together, I just want you to know, I don't really want to do stand-up. I really want to tell stories. And I would like to forge a career similar to David Sedaris and start writing books and telling stories. And they were like, that's not a career. And I was like, no, it is. I'm going to make it one. They're like, that doesn't exist. Can you just do stand-up? And I was like, well, I'm going to make it exist. And nothing drove me further than that. I mean, and then I proceeded to order the most expensive steak on the menu after they told me that they weren't going to support me, because I was like, I'm not going to work with you much longer. But to me, that saying of someone sitting down to me and saying, you can't do this, I was like, oh, yes, I will. And I will. And it was like unbelievable to me how much, once I focused on it, that it really did happen. And I always think of that moment as being something that almost everyone has experienced when someone says, I have a dream, and someone says, shuts your dream down. That feeling of being resilient against that, I think that's a really universal thing. So that's how I'm able to convey my story. It's not as simple as I majored in storytelling and was placed somewhere, because none of that happened. Yeah.
I love that. It's almost like the origin story that you have there. And,
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking, you touched on as well, where so many different, people who saw success, like Steve Jobs, like Lorne Michaels, they talk about, their failures as part of like their journey. And I imagine there's a lot of people that I talk to now, especially with COVID, where, they've been made redundant, or like their company has had to shut. And you just kind of like wonder now, like how many stories
So
are being
hard.
created right now because of that. Because of like,
There's going to be huge career shifts. Yeah.
yeah.
There will be huge career shifts after this. And it's interesting because every time I'm less busy than I was before this, obviously, when I was traveling all over the world and getting on planes constantly. But, when I get to do what I love, when I have busier weeks, I'm so happy and fulfilled. And I'm one of the few people that was like, no, I'm sad because I really don't want to make a career shift. I really just want to keep doing what I was doing. And there were a lot of people that were like, I'm sad because I realized what I was doing was making me miserable. Or there's a lot of different emotions going right now, but I just really want to keep doing this. Yeah. And I'm grateful that I have been able to so far.
That's fantastic. And, with the work that you're doing, you mentioned the long-term student, the voiceover artist earlier. Are there any other examples, like people that you've worked with or with, where you were just so delighted to see the progress that they made after speaking to you?
I've had so many cases of this. I mean, I'll tell you a few. I had a pro athlete who was kind of a celebrity in his youth in my classes, and he didn't really know how to tell his own story. He was a dad now and looking for the next chapter. And he started telling stories in the class. He recorded one and put it online, and he made this joke saying that it had 27 views, but one of those views was someone looking for a former athlete TV host for something. You know, he's like, it was 27 views, but you only need one of the right views for it to work. And so it showed this other side of his very rough exterior. He ended up, I was cooking dinner one night and he called me. I get very close with my students, but he called me and was like, I just got this job based off of them seeing this softer side of me, telling a story about my daughter. I can't believe this, you know? And it was just unbelievable thing. I've had other people that have been through, although I have no degree in therapy and I don't claim to, but I have had some people have some really emotional breakthroughs. People that have owned stories of trauma, that have told them out loud and gotten rid of them, or talked about them and realized they weren't alone, or talked about them in front of a crowd. And it's been really, really helpful for their personal journeys. I've had a company called me once and said, I don't know why we're not sealing the deal. I think we're just doing a bunch of PowerPoint presentations and trying to acquire the client, and it's not working. Can you come in and teach us how to tell stories? And this is not just because of me. They did the work, but they were on the cover, you know, of Adweek a few years later. And I was like, wow, look at this. They've come so far. It's amazing. So, you know, I worked with another company that I changed the way they shared their origin story and made it more personal. They were talking about the bigger theme of it. And instead I said, you know, tell about the people involved in it. And they really changed the way that they talk about it. So it's, I could go on and on, but companies, people, you know, individuals, everything, I've seen massive changes in them, and it's been really rewarding.
That sounds fantastic. My final question is, what is next for Margot?
Well, are we ever getting out of this? Because I was supposed to be in England right now, and I'm not there. So obviously I can't. What I miss the most is connecting with people in person and going to a new place and giving a talk and talking to the people and hearing their stories. And I drastically miss that right now. So what's next? I'm working on a 4th book, which is completely off-brand for me. I've been taking this time to learn how to write a thriller, and I'm writing a thriller just as a new challenge to myself. And I think I'm finished with the outline and have a few of the chapters done, but I've been plugging away on that, taking some classes with that to learn that new skill. And beyond that, growing my business still, more keynotes, more workshops. I've expanded to that. I also now teach memoir writing as well. I used to just teach storytelling. I also teach people how to I'm teaching people how to write their stories now instead of just telling them. So both of those things combined. So just forward movement, you know, as long as I get to keep making a living in the field of storytelling, which someone told me was impossible, I'm doing okay. So.
Well, you were saying earlier on that you don't want to make a career pivot, but you may end up finding yourself as like a career in like in fiction rather than
I know
fiction storytelling, which is
it's been we'll see. I think it's a good book. I thought about how many of them, you know, when I read for pleasure, I read thrillers. And then I asked my agent, I said, what's the deal with thriller novels? She said, it's the #1 selling a book in book sales is the female-led thriller. I said, oh my goodness, that's what I'm writing. She goes, you know, stick with it. Let's try something else for this next book and we'll see. I mean, I plan to write many, many books in my life. So this just might be the one-off path. Why not right now try something crazy, right?
I love that. And I think that's a great sentiment to end on. Why not try something crazy? Margot, firstly, I think just want to say thank you so much again for joining us today. I'll be linking to where you can buy your books, like in the notes of this video. And also I'll link to some of the videos that you mentioned as well. I think the Jim Carrey video, the Monica Leitman talk, I think it would be great for folks that watch this to also check those out as well. Margot, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.